This is the beginning of week 4. Let's go ahead and get started, or as they used to say in my heyday, let's get it started in here. So this week we're talking about culture as values again. Last week I presented, I wouldn't just say one side of the story, but I really presented the side of the story where the culture as values idea came from within sociology and how it's been used. In your responses last week, or in your quiz last week, I think overall the class did pretty darn well. I'm going to be posting, by the time you see this lecture, I'll have posted the quiz questions. Please go through those, get a sense of what you missed. If you have any questions, get back in touch with me again. But I detected in some of the early in the week questions about the readings that you were hitting on almost exactly what I wanted you to hit on, which is that reading from Schills was abstract, confusing, kind of hard to get a handle on. That gives us an insight that there might be some problems to this culture as values approach. So what I'm going to do today, really the lecture is divided into two parts. The first is I'm going to go over problems with this approach. I'm going to actually go through the arguments of 3 different sociologists about problems with the values, using values as a way to understand culture. And then I'm going to go through 3 approaches to how we could kind of reclaim the values approach. What are some real useful ways about thinking through this concept of values? By the end of this lecture, the end of this week, which ends our look at values, you should have a real good sense of where the sociological study of values comes from, what the problems are with that, how we can use values, and then maybe most importantly at all, you'll have some tools for your own thinking as you wade into the world. Because as I've said throughout this course, the concept of values is one of the most potent, powerful ways the culture out there, that's interesting, the world out there talks about values, okay? But they often, commentators, political writers, speech writers oftentimes use values in this kind of abstract, vague sense that doesn't really give us a sociological understanding of society, and sometimes they use the phrase values in a divisive stance. This has particularly been the case over the last 30 years in American politics, where the word values itself has sometimes been attempted to be claimed by one side of the spectrum of American politics. What we're doing in this course as sociologists is to say, what does values mean as a concept that we can actually use to understand the social world? So let's dig in a little deeper here. So again, I'm going to start with what 3 different sociologists have said, or I guess what 3 different arguments against the culture as values approach. The first sociologist in this case is me, Adler. We're actually gonna pick apart Schill's argument a little bit. So, argument number 1 against values. So we'll say against Schill's. So this is my thinking, some of your thinking, and against the arguments we countered in Schill's. So first, recall that in Schill's argument, and also Parsons, these are 2 sociologists, 20th century, working together, values are abstract. They're at the center of society, so they have this strange GPS sort of pull that I've talked about before, in which people are kind of connected intangibly with the center of society and kind of intangibly with each other through this thing called values. And that for the Schill's concept, order was very important. Values were really about fundamentally kind of keeping order, keeping control of society, keeping it, and this is in this 1950s, 1940s conception, keeping things from falling apart. And values were modeled by and enforced by elites. So now let's pick this apart a little bit. One problem in this approach is it sees deviance as equal to lack of values. Now let me say a little bit more about that. What do we mean by deviance? Well, you might have encountered, if you've taken other sociology classes, something called the study of deviance. real shorthand, what that means is behaviors, the study of behaviors that are considered non-mainstream. So smoking marijuana, though that's becoming less and less deviant. Mental illness was sometimes used to be considered a form of deviance. 40 or 50 years ago, study of homosexuality was in this category, and you can see that the category deviant itself, like all of society, changes over time. So we might consider drug dealing still a deviant activity, things that also have strong moral claims, or from broad-based arguments you've heard out there, have strong value arguments about right or wrong. But just generally, we want to say that the study of deviance was about these categories. We might even call hipsters a deviant social group. Wall Street occupiers, that could be studied as deviants. Civil rights protesters, deviants. And you start to see a problem with the word deviance, which is back in Schill's and Parsons' day, deviance basically equaled people who did things seemingly against mainstream values, and i.e. the deviant, people who did deviant things, were seen as lacking values. So what I'm trying to say here is that in our earlier era, particularly when we said the study of deviance, there was often kind of a background assumption that there was something wrong with these people whom we were studying. One of the great attacks versus this was the discovery or the articulation of what we call labeling theory, which was in the 1960s, 1970s. Howard Becker is one of the sociologists that led this. And in labeling theory, what Becker tried to show was that elites and institutions will oftentimes point to a behavior, smoking marijuana, homosexuality, civil rights protesters, name it as deviant, and by naming it, suggesting they lack values, i.e. are not part of the mainstream, i.e. are wrong, are morally wrong. So this is that deviance equals lack of values is kind of operating in the background of the way Schills and Parsons understood values. What are some other problems here? One is that another problem in Schill's argument was that elites equal values. So let me unpack that a little bit too. In the mid-20th century, we have massive growth in bureaucratic life, in particular the American security state. This is the central act of the Cold War, if you remember. And so you had all sorts of development of the power of elites, a power of people with specialized skills and specialized powers who became ensconced in bureaucracies that were often hard to penetrate. But as sociologists in that era pointed out, these bureaucracies were becoming much more and more a part of social life. One problem, though, is in Schill's vision, the heads of major institutions and bureaucracies are seen as elites, and in Schill's version, they're seen as having better values or being the place where we look to find values. But there's all sorts of reasons this is a big problem. What are some of these reasons? First off, think of our own practical experience. The last 10 years, we've seen an absolute kind of demolishing, if there ever was truth, which there wasn't, to this argument of elites of institutions are the holders, the only or the best holder of values. The last 10 years have proved that wrong. You can think about the recent talk about Newt Gingrich's affairs, which ironically 15 years ago in 1994, 1996, Gingrich himself was pushing and critiquing Bill Clinton. So in both these cases, on the left and the right, you can see examples of these are elites, heads of major institutions, but maybe not the central place to go to look for quote-unquote values. You can consider the run-up to the Iraq War, which actually resembled a lot the run-up to the Vietnam War, which involved wide-scale systematic institutional lying. That the press became complicit in. In other words, putting out rationales for a decision that basically already been made. We wanted to go to war with Vietnam. We wanted to go with a war with Iraq, the we being elites. And therefore, we're going to put arguments out there about supposed finding of uranium, supposed Saddam Hussein just about to have a weaponizable nuclear weapon that could get to the United States. So we start to see that there have been huge elite failures, and if that is the case, then maybe we shouldn't be seeing elites as the center of values. So that's another problem in the culture of values approach. So let me summarize these problems really quick. The use of values as a way to think about culture should avoid implying that values hold all of society together, because it leads to this problem of seeing people who do things different as deviant and i.e. without values. Our eventual approach of thinking about culture as values should also be skeptical of any claims that elites were somehow the place to find values or somehow better in their values. Now, let me move to critique number 2. And this was leveled by one of the all-time sociological greats, C. Wright Mills. So writing, especially in the 1960s, C. Wright Mills helps us to understand another problem of the values as a way to understand culture. C. Wright Mills, if you're not familiar with him, wrote a terrific book called The Sociological Imagination. A lot of people have to read that in an introduction to sociology class. He also wrote another terrific book called The Power Elite, by which he tracked the way that elite worked in the Cold War era and how kind of secretive and ensconced and anti-democratic elites had become. And he was really kind of the first sociologist that really helped the general public to understand the power of the tools of sociology. In 1940, he writes an important article called, I'll just say this to you, Situated Actions and Vocabularies of Motive. What Wright argues in this article is that sociologists are thinking that they are measuring values, but actually they have the causalities of the way of the role of values incorrect. And what Mills argues is that in the course of daily life, there are all sorts of situations, coming across a homeless person, getting into a confrontation while driving your automobile through the highways of LA, saying hello to a coworker or boss. There's all these situations where action occurs in which what we do is actually rather formulaic, and actually what we do is rather predictable. So when you come across a homeless person, most people are either going to avert their eyes, or some small slice of people may actually look and interact with the homeless person and offer something. If you're arguing with somebody in traffic, what's usually going to happen is some sort of kind of, F you sort of thing, the middle finger, agitation, maybe try and retaliate by cutting people off. Or if you're running into your boss on the way into work, you're going to say some sort of hello, and sociologists looking at this situation would see that your body language might be a little deferential. You might be expected to address them first, thereby reaffirming their superiority. Good morning, boss. They respond to you, maybe say something witty, you laugh, and then you shuffle off. Your break off from the interaction is much more deferential. So Mills is pointing out first that so much of action, situations of action, are rather predictable and recurring. Our responses are often the same. Now let me pause there really quick and I'll come back to Mills.